Welcome everyone for joining us today for this live webinar on Accelerate Copilot for Microsoft 365 Success with AvePoint. In the world of AI productivity, Copilot for Microsoft 365 is here to really transform the way we work. And Copilot is a business opportunity for you, our partners. And at the same time, it provides assistance to your customers by helping them increase their productivity. Now, we're very fortunate today to have Jay Hall from AvePoint, Senior Channel Solution Engineer, join us on how to take advantage of what AvePoint has to offer. Jay will share with us how AvePoint can help us ensure a sustainable adoption of Copilot for Microsoft 365. For those who don't know me, I'm Sylvain Fontaine, Technical Specialist, Modern Work and Security here at IT Cloud in the Microsoft pre-sales team. Now, you might ask yourself, what is the Microsoft pre-sale specialist team here at IT Cloud? Well, we're here to help our internal partners in the sale of Microsoft Cloud solution. Now, whether it be in 365 or in Teams or in Copilot, as we're going to discuss today with other external partners in AvePoint, or whether it be through Azure. The whole idea is to really help you approach, the solution, fulfill the needs of your clients in the best way possible. Now you can book a call with us, and that's why I'm showing here this new bookings link that we have available for the Microsoft specialist team. And here I've gone and highlighted policies and insights as to one of the services that we offer, since this is the one that we're going to be discussing today. So you can either use the QR code, or you can click right now on book a call. The deck is shared live, so all the links are clickable. So that way you can go ahead and open that window in your browser, and whenever you're available, you see availability, just go ahead and book a call, and we have 10 different specific services offered for you guys at the moment. And as well, we are on YouTube. So this video, along with other videos, is available on our YouTube channel. Now we have others with Defender for Business. We have our Excellence program on Azure, or other Excellence program where we talk about Microsoft Business Premium and Copilot. We have others where we talk about the Bitdefender versus Defender for Business. So there's quite a collection of videos up there. So you're more than welcome to go and browse through those. All right, Jay, all yours.
All right. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Jay Hall, and I am a Senior Channel Solution Engineer here at AvePoint. I've been working with our technical partners, right, in order to be able to educate folks on the AvePoint solutions and platform, and how they can better assist you in terms of being able to adopt, as well as empower your end users and organizations with regards to your services, your platforms, and your offerings through the AvePoint lens and AvePoint solutions. And so the way that we're going to do this is we're going to talk a little bit about first what AvePoint can help you with, right, and how that journey begins. And that starts primarily using the partner program. The goal of the AvePoint partner program is to guide you on a way to be able to effectively manage your experience from onboarding, maturation through training and adoption, as well as management and lifecycle needs through the customer experience and journey. And the goal is to provide you with resources and assets that will be valuable for you to essentially start your experience in terms of how do we actually use the AvePoint platform to optimally take advantage of all the resources that are out there, so you can be better prepared for something like a Copilot for Microsoft 365 journey. As a result, you'll see here that we have quite a bit of information that's readily available to you. This is a snapshot of what it looks like inside of the partner portal. The goal of the partner portal here, with something like our campaign in a box kit, is to give you a guided experience on how you can start from beginning, right? Whether that's crafting your strategic approach, all the way down through implementation and go to market of a solution associated with Copilot for Microsoft 365. Now, the platform and the advantages of this are that you're going to see several different ways and mechanisms that you would actually be able to functionally start, right? Whether that's going to be through training, whether that will be through understanding and education, whether that might be through building out and using sample kits like our SOW that can give you a starting point and framework for how to better optimally leverage your Copilot journey through the AvePoint lens, or simply crafting and culminating an experience, whether that's your marketing strategy or building out a particular service package and offering so that you can start without having to necessarily build everything from scratch, right? Our goal is to turn what is already available to you into something that you can quickly and seamlessly adopt and then begin to actually successfully measure in a meaningful fashion. And this really is the bulk of the accelerating process, right? With the partner program, it gives you a way to start to successfully transform how you're actually working with something like Copilot, which, as we know, is focused primarily on making users more efficient. Now, AI is something that every organization has been talking about and thinking about, right? The reality is that this is a tool that is meant to transform the way that we work. However, there is going to be a challenge with this, right? Just because it's meant to help us doesn't necessarily mean that it completely understands us. There's often too much data that lives out there. The reality is that understanding that we have so much data that could be a 5 year, 10 year, 15 year tenure, right? That data and information ultimately will get stale and old potentially. We need to understand that more data does not always mean a better outcome. As an example of this, I might ask Copilot to give me what our current travel policies are and what our actual allowances would be on a day to day basis if I was trying to transfer my work to somewhere like Chicago. In that case, Copilot will go out and ask that question to any document that it can get its hands on. The challenge being, with more data, we run the risk of this potentially looking at old versions of the same document or old documents in and of itself. So I might get an answer to a question that is from 2011. And therein lies the problem. Making your data more efficient is just one step, right? In order to make this fully realized, we need to understand what some of the actual benefits are versus what some of the actual challenges are. And this is really where the bulk of understanding Copilot in and of itself comes in, right? As a business, our goal is to get better results, deeper results, and potentially simplify the research process. At the end of the day, there's still the human element, though. So we need these responses to either be personalized or be specifically built with the context that we're trying to work in. So if I was delivering an answer as a response to a demo that I did, depending on my relationship with that user or that person, I may end up needing my answer to be more formal versus being more direct. Those responses require a specific set of data and a specific set of inputs. Being able to protect your tenant means not only from the user's lens, but also from the data lens. At the end of the day, your tenant is only as good as your security posture is. Copilot doesn't create a totally new set of risks, but it does enhance and expose those risks. And this is where understanding that you need some sort of security solution in place that's going to help ensure that your M365 instance is actually ready and prepared for the journey of adopting AI and introducing it into a user based environment. Because users will get very creative and they will often do things that you least expect. But if AI works appropriately and properly, it will ultimately increase the productivity in your environment by providing not only additional information and insights, but by potentially automating that process as well. In order to get those expected benefits and outcomes, we have to consider the quality of our data and the relevance of it. If you do not keep only the data that's most recent and most relevant, you run the risk of getting old answers from AI. Privacy is going to be key. I may be a part of the everyone group, and the everyone group might be used inside of our HR team. If I ask AI, right, Copilot to answer a question, I run the risk of taking that private data and pulling it into my environment and then asking it to create a net new document, which creates a challenge and a risk because I'm now exposing internal only information potentially to external facing users and organizations. This means that our security and compliance strategy has to be scrutinized to a T. The users that are given access to AI have to be held to a higher standard if we want the best success of using AI with the least amount of risk. But if your compliance strategy is too stringent, you run the risk of not getting adoption. And as a result of this, those licenses that you're now paying for will either have to be completely terminated or reassigned to users who may end up being able to get the most value from this. And so this is where understanding what the benefits you're looking for are directly translate into what you need to consider from a readiness standpoint. In order to unlock the full potential of your M365 Copilot journey, we essentially have aligned with three core pillars in the way that Microsoft functions. The first part, right, is about preparing your data. That's going to be simple as centralizing your data in M365. There are many different flavors of Copilot. The one that we are talking about is Copilot for Microsoft 365. As a result, the data must reside in either SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, Groups, Exchange, but it has to live in an M365 service. So making sure that you can move and migrate your data there is going to be key. That data that is moved needs to have some level of validity, though. If you're keeping old and stale data, that's going to be just as big of a problem if you centralize that in a place that it doesn't need to be accessed by AI. So leaving behind your old data is going to be important. Once that data and those workspaces are identified and they're consolidated, we need to lock it down and secure it. And this is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time today. By securing that data and making sure that there is a framework in place right now, it gives us the ability to turn on something like Copilot because we know we're ready right now. But Copilot is a license that doesn't go away. This is something that continues to be added. And more importantly, it means new data will constantly be generated. As that new data is generated, we ultimately have to think about how do we optimize our governance framework to ensure that Copilot isn't just rolled out successfully, but that we remain compliant with those best practices and business requirements moving forward. Now, as we mentioned, we're going to focus primarily on step two. And the goal of step two is to build and establish a solid foundation for your deployment of M365 Copilot. By securing this, we're essentially looking to understand where data is either sensitive in nature and or potentially overshared. You can think of these two things as who has access, how they have access versus what they have access to and what they've been doing with it. Those four commonalities are the building blocks for securing and locking down your data. When we actually think of the strategy that we need to be able to lock this down, we're really looking at this from the lens of permissions management and analysis of data through risk assessments. But the goal is not to stop at an assessment, but rather to use that as the roadmap that will ultimately create a governance framework that you can leave behind in the customer's environment so that for as long as they have Copilot, they have this governance framework in place that ensures that they remain compliant and that they don't need to worry about these things moving forward. This is going to include, right, understanding Copilot searching and how it's accessing your data. This is going to include understanding the access rights of users and what they have access to. Because I might be a part of the everyone group and that might be used inside of our legal or finance team, but that doesn't mean that I ever actually get an alert or a notification that I have access to that legal or finance team. I might just be in a group that was added to it. So understanding that Copilot magnifies these potential risks by making it easy to find data that users otherwise couldn't is going to be important. And then finally, making sure that all of this data and all this information is easily accessible through the proper metadata as well as tagging. Because without metadata and tagging, your data essentially is only really limited to the information that something like SharePoint understands natively. Things like the created by, the last modified by. Those don't give you context into what type of document. The solution to these problems is going to be to identify and manage that sensitive information in M365 with something like our insight solution. The goal is to ultimately take what you've identified and build potential labeling strategies that give you an easier way to say, I want to lock down this data because it lives inside of potentially an externally shared team. So any team that might be externally shared, I don't want that to have any sensitive data. It can only have external facing documents. By following through from the journey of understanding your challenge and implementing solutions, you'll begin to actually realize the full benefit of something like Copilot. Because if I'm reducing my risk and exposure, I allow Copilot to do exactly what it needs to do with the context being driven primarily by the user's input. Automating that process is your goal, right? So when we all think about how do we get a user or organization ready to use Copilot, we probably are thinking about assessments. But I challenge you to not only think about this from a initial assessment standpoint, but rather from the ongoing governance framework. If you build the automation that keeps your tenant secure, you give yourself the best possible chance for success in order to ensure that your Copilot's governance framework remains intact moving forward. And that's really our goal, is to take you from the initial onboarding phase and assessment with Copilot, give you the building blocks to start this journey, and then finally end that experience with something that the customer can tangibly keep. So you don't have to necessarily log in and constantly re-review reports, but instead they're getting closer to real-time updates as well as potentially automatic fixing, so that this is essentially a add-on to their Copilot. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, and then I'm going to switch to a demonstration of the actual platform. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this, I'll give you just a brief high level of what we're going over. So what you're looking at here is going to be the App Online Services portal. For those folks who are not familiar, this is where things like the backup solution, as well as the security solution and governance framework solution that we're going to talk about for Copilot live. This is broken up into two separate halves. So the first one is Insights for Microsoft 365. The second one is Policies for Microsoft 365. With Insights for Microsoft 365, this is going to be that initial assessment of their environment. The goal here, right, is to leverage the overview to understand where they are today, where there's potential risks, and where there's areas for optimization and or improvement. As I go through this, you want to make sure that you're understanding the exposure versus sensitivity. That exposure is things like the oversharing. What type of user? Are they external? Are they internal? Are these folks who might be a part of a large AD group? Are we using built-in groups like the everyone group instead of sharing permissions with individual users specifically, causing a potential breach in who has access to this data? That oversharing is only relevant, however, if we're cross-referencing that against the sensitivity of the data. And so sensitivity, we simply can think of as what type of data that is. Examples of that could be things focused on HIPAA compliance, right? So that might be PII, data that might be credit card numbers or social security numbers, could be ABA routing numbers. These are all things that Microsoft are already cataloging inside of a customer's tenant. Microsoft already understands this data today. However, you need a way to be able to assess it and then build context to it. Every organization, no matter how small they are, will have exponential amounts of data, right? So when we think of this, an organization that might only have 100 to 200 users could easily have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of documents in their M365 tenant. This means you need a way to be able to filter the noise, right? We don't care about all 1 million documents. What we care about is a subset of that data, information that meets a very strict criteria so that we get to a point where we can identify the documents we need to focus on. But your goal isn't to target these documents, right? We're not trying to file chase each and every one of these. What we want is to understand what collaboration workspaces are the biggest offenders for sensitive information so that we can build policies that help us to track this and mitigate it at a macro lens and view. That's the ultimate goal here. So when I think of this, right, my overview is where I start. This is how I understand some of the key metrics and things that we need to address. But when it comes time to actually do some investigation, this is where you want to drill in. By doing so, right, I can get a quick snapshot and understanding of the various different types of workspaces that ultimately might have the highest risk. If I were to look at this from a slightly different lens, right, I can choose what value I want to focus on today. So that might be focusing on my high risk workspaces. This looks at all of the M365 workspaces you see over here. So we're not just focusing on the user, we're also looking at Teams, SharePoint Online, OneDrive, as well as Microsoft 365 groups. This is looking at it from all workspaces. So if I care about Teams, I can focus on Teams. If I cared about SharePoint, I could focus on SharePoint. Your goal should be to isolate the workspaces that have the most potential risk for exposure, build policies that address those risks, and then where necessary, you could potentially manually remediate thereafter. So how do we do that? Well, our goal should be to take the information from insights and build out policies that can potentially fix them. Down here at the bottom left, you'll see something called the intelligent remediation. Intelligent remediation is exactly that. It's taking the data and information from this customer's environment and it's showing you which reports potentially have issues that we can use the data and information to build policies against. So you're essentially taking data driven reporting and mapping that to a fix inside of M365 that would be valuable for the customer to have moving forward so you don't necessarily have to see these same issues in the future. So, what are some common ones? Well, most of these here will be valuable in some way, shape, or form for any customer, right? If I see a insights report here, chances are there's a good reason for why we probably will need to build a rule to address these in some way. Not every report, however, is an issue, right? It is expected that an organization may have external links, but making sure that those links, for example, are available to the right individuals through the right workspaces is the key. So let's take the first one here, the shadow users concept. Shadow users are simply something AvePoint calls as a cross reference. What we're looking at is the members of the team or group and cross referencing that with the access in the underlying SharePoint site. If I share a file in Teams to a user, that user may not be a part of my team. They may not be a member. But by sharing that data, I have now exposed the underlying SharePoint site to one or more individuals without ever being able to view that inside of my team's reporting. This is a potential risk because if someone is properly tracking Teams membership through the Teams app, they may have no idea that the underlying SharePoint site has unique permissions or sharing links associated. So this is a good thing that we should probably address when it comes to a Copilot conversation. If I click create policies up here, what you'll see is that I'm going to want to create a rule. The rule is going to target either 365 groups or teams based on the icon. And the rule I'm going to create is called remove shadow users. Clicking on create policy takes me to the second half of the platform, which is the policies for Microsoft 365. As a result of this, I can then create a policy here. By creating this policy, I can then target my team, add a rule, and I'm going to look for remove shadow users. This is where the power of the platform comes in. Because this can leverage the data from insights, it's valuable to start your journey there. That's why you will always see in your first beginnings of building out a Copilot's governance framework, you want to assess the data and the users and the workspaces with insights before building policies that target those specific areas of improvement. So if I create a rule for removing shadow users and I decide that I don't actually want to do anything else, we can implement this in a three-phased or pronged approach. And what we end up calling that is sort of a crawl, walk, run approach, right? The first thing I'm doing, if I add the policy just like this, without making any adjustments, we call that crawling. The reason is because all this rule is doing is going out and looking for any team that the SharePoint site's permissions don't line up with the team membership. That's going to bubble up that data into the dashboard over here on the left. That's the starting point, right? We just want to understand where this is happening. With insights, that information is gathered nightly through incremental scans. With policies, you have the ability to actually get a little bit more granular and build this down to the 2-hour mark, meaning this can get much more real time, comparatively speaking, which is one of the advantages of using policies to do this and not just necessarily relying on insights. By having that dashboard, it's also your historical proof. The dashboard proves what you found and whether or not it was fixed. Now, customers might say, I don't really want to log into a portal. Can you send this to me after the fact? The answer is yes. We can either send it to the group and team owners, and or we could send it to a specific set of individuals. And so the goal here is to empower either their security team, maybe you as an MSP, whoever wants these updates, they no longer have to log into the portal. Every time we find a group of shadow users, based on this interval, we'll send out emails and we'll let you know what we found. Because this is incremental in nature, it'll only send out the alerts when we find net new instances of a shadow user. This is that walk approach. All we've done so far is make it easy for you to find the data, make it easy for you to report on it, and then give you actionable links so that it goes from email to the policy so that you can fix it. But it still requires manual intervention. So for organizations who are not comfortable with rolling out enforcement of rules and configurations, but they still want to understand where they're being violated, you'll probably stop here. Now, for those organizations who are ready to adopt the full run, that means they understand the list of violations. They understand the frequency of those violations through notifications. They grasp that these violations are in fact real and they're not potentially false positives. All that's true, and they say, we don't even want to see the list. We just want you to automatically fix it. The run approach says, we're going to enable the option called if a violation is found. Every policy that has this sort of option means we can actually automatically fix and remove the policies directly from the environment. So the net result is we're monitoring and looking for these shadow users, folks who have access to data that the team owner doesn't know about. We are alerting the team owner as well as our security admin. And then finally, we're automatically fixing and removing the violation. But just like with a Copilot license, we recommend you do this in a controlled environment first. So we don't recommend you enable this on the entire tenant and just automatically start fixing things, right? This goes back to that conversation we were talking about before. We don't want compliance to butt heads with productivity. And if I start making mass changes to the environment, you run the risk that users will simply start to adopt bad habits, like shadow IT, that could potentially cause other risks and other issues. So these policies need to be implemented in a thoughtful but controlled manner. If I did this, I may then want to scope it. So assigning the policy is the next phase. And this essentially just tells us which workloads we want to target. Now, if you're not familiar with AvePoint's containerization process, for now, just know that everything will show up in a default group. And when I click on this, I can see all of my teams or site collections in question. So I may want to only do this on a test site first, so I know exactly what the impact will be. This ensures, just like with the Copilot license, that users don't have to worry about whether or not they are going to see data and information, right, that they should not see, but more importantly, that the impact will be smaller in scope. It simplifies your ability to get buy-in from the organization while simultaneously still educating them and getting them to actually build upon the governance strategy that you're trying to roll out by starting to adopt this in a smaller subset of data before rolling it out, just like they're doing with the Copilot license. No one wants to commit to a $30 license for the entire tenant if they can't even get their pilot users to potentially use it. Same holds true for your governance strategies. So this is one example of a policy that you may want to ultimately track against. Now, another one that we may want to track against, right, might be removing inactive guest users. And this is not necessarily something that you need to do for every tenant. But the important thing to remember is that while guest users don't have licenses themselves, so they can't use Copilot, there is a problem and potential with a guest user. And that's the fact that anyone with a Copilot license has the ability to create data that could then be exposed to them. This is what we call an indirect risk. Indirect risks may not be your first priority, but they absolutely should be a part of your governance roadmap. If you do not think about these things and consider them, organizations will often fall into the trap of, we're going to do only what's required today and we'll worry about it later on. And that makes sense when you're risk adverse. But Copilot inherently means every organization should be risk adverse, but they should be risk adverse for the user's lens, not for the purpose of the organization. Meaning they don't want users to be the thing that creates a potential problem. And one of those problems can easily be granting access to data that they created from sensitive information, sharing it out, and then it's sitting there. By removing inactive guest users, we give the tenant the ability to start from a cleaner state. Now, this one, right, targets tenant level. So this isn't something that you would do at the workspace level. But over here, you'll see under the tenant, this is an example of where we can see that. You'll see that we actually have a rule that's already created for this. And its sole purpose is to look for any inactive user who has not logged in within the last 120 days. In this case, we're using this as that crawl approach, right? So we're not automatically removing any user or making any immediate changes in the tenant. We're not even sending email notifications out. We just want there to be an auditable and defensible list that proves that this is happening. So when it comes time for in the future, we need to potentially deploy or roll this out to the full tenant, we can do so. By creating these policies in this state, you get the ability to essentially map this and roadmap it in with very little impact to the tenant, but with a lot of potential for actual value. This also means that if it's already configured this way, all you need to do is come in later on and potentially modify and edit the rule if you want to switch from just auditing to actual enforcement and automatic changing. If you don't want the impact to be too great, we can simply block the user from signing in, thereby keeping that record in Azure and still making it possible for you to re-enable it in the future. Now, there are a couple of actual rules that we would recommend you potentially create, right? But the goal of those rules should ultimately be to target different workspace types. So that may be SharePoint. You may have a bucket of rules for Teams. You will have a bucket of rules for OneDrive, and you will have a bucket of rules for 365 groups. In a perfect world, the buckets of rules that you create, they give you the foundation for where your various different types of either sensitive information or highly confidential or potentially collaborative workspaces will live. Let's take this one as an example. So here, right, we've built out 5 common rules that we think should generally be enforced in some way, shape, or form, right? Scanning for orphan users is another concept that AvePoint somewhat uniquely calls, right? The idea here is that these are users groups that have been deleted from your Entra ID environment. However, they still have access into SharePoint. If these users remain here, these are still going to be individuals who have access to data through things like anonymous links and organization links. So if I'm a Copilot user, I have access to all of this data. I share all of that data out. At some point, that user may no longer be a part of the company or the organization anymore. Even though they are not in Entra ID, they may still have access through something like a sharing link, or they may have direct permission somewhere that allows them to sign into a site. That means we need to make sure that we're doing the cleanup, not just in Entra ID, but we're also doing the cleanup in the M365 services. This one is focused on cleaning up the actual M365 services, which is why this rule targets SharePoint. If you do the cleanup appropriately, this data and this information would no longer be overshared. So in the event that someone else wants to collaborate and work with me with the data that I've created from Copilot, I know that Miguel may not have access anymore in the future. So we're containing who has access to the information that's still being collaborated on by removing users who no longer should have access, but their name might still be listed somewhere either in the document or in a SharePoint site collection user list. This is cleanup of permissions through policy enforcement. If you remember, Insights allows us to do this manually. Policies is all about automating that process. If I can automate it, it means that it will continue to do this in perpetuity while Copilot's in play. So I don't need to continuously do this. I set it up once, and that's really it. Another one would be around sharing link expiration enforcement. So we know that links are required in a tenant. There's no way around that, right? Whether we're sharing data internally or we're sharing data externally, we have to be able to share data in some way, shape, or form. Otherwise, everyone's going to simply copy it and then paste it and send it to someone, creating duplicate copies of data. That is obviously inefficient. And if you remember from before, that's one of the no-nos of Copilot, having multiple different documents that we can potentially get varying answers for the same question creates confusion for AI and ultimately can lead to misleading information. So making sure that sharing is available is important, but sharing must be done thoughtfully. So creating enforcement of maybe only 15 days for links that are shared with the anyone group, links that are shared with our organization, right? So only in our organization, 30 days. Now, in this case, I probably recommend you also set an expiration for links that are shared with specific individuals, but you don't have to, because at the minimum, you know that this is tied to one or more individuals, right? This is another one where Copilot enhances the problem. It magnifies it because while the link might have been created and I might have gotten an alert about this a month ago, there's no telling whether or not I even remember that that link exists. If I'm not still using it, cleanup should happen automatically. Or at the minimum, Somewhere there should be a record for every link that is beyond the configured framework time. So we don't have to automatically delete the links. We can simply say we want to find every link that has lived over 15 days when it's shared with anyone. For links that are shared internally, we just want to find all links that have been created over a month ago. We're not going to enforce anything, but it gives the users an auditable and defensible position to take. For those folks who want the automatic enforcement, we simply select the option here. This means that Copilot would no longer see those links and would no longer be able to use them for old data that might have been shared with me 2 months ago. It helps to clean up what I have access to. It helps to limit the exposure of that data. And it helps to ensure that Copilot is accessing only the most recent business critical data there. The last one I kind of want to talk about is going to be around users and groups restriction. This is really for when we want to create information barriers. Probably the biggest benefit of Copilot is that it makes it easy for you to search the entire sea of your tenant. Anywhere I have access, I run the risk of being able to access it with Copilot. This also means it magnifies the potential risk. Data that I didn't know I had access to could become an issue. Let's take a real world scenario. HR, often during the onboarding process, will have to share documents with new users. They might do this through a siloed site collection, or they might share specific documents that live inside the HR team, specifically with one or more individuals. What happens if HR decides, well, actually, every time someone's onboarded, we automatically need to give them access to this document? I have a great idea. Let's use the everyone group and let's actually use that to ensure that every net new onboarded employee automatically has access to these documents. Seems like a great idea. The problem is maybe after onboarding, they no longer need that access. Or even worse, maybe by adding the everyone group to that team, we've now introduced potential documents which used to only live for the HR team to now be exposed to everyone in the company. This is a no-no. Furthermore, Copilot will obviously be able to find this and share this. This is where that whole conversation around someone being able to quickly ask Copilot, what's the salary of my CEO, comes into play. So we can create a policy that says, let's restrict the ability to use the everyone group in any site. This means we have to be thoughtful about permission and sharings. When we do this, if I want to share a document with Miguel, I would have to use Miguel's actual name, not the everyone group. Now, there's obviously other ways that this can be worked around. So we might want to also include things like entre groups, right? If I create a group called the all company group, I might want to include that here as well. And so the whole goal is we can start to lock down where someone can be added. And by virtue of leveraging groups, we can further limit who actually is being granted access to those sites. And an alternative way to think of this is instead of using the everyone group, I might want to specifically look for particular users. So at AvePoint, we have our support team. The support team, everyone might be a part of a group called support. So what I want is to say that the AvePoint support group cannot be added to the sites that I'm going to apply this to. When I save this and create this policy, I'm then going to go back to my scope and I'm going to adjust the scope so that I know that this is only going to be applicable to the sites that I need to. So I can drill in here, and then maybe I'm looking for, I'll just say my demo sites for now. So any site that's in this container will look for that AvePoint support group, and it's going to say, let's make sure that we find every single site where that's added and create a list of it. If I enable the automatic fix, the automatic fix is going to say, let's actually automatically remove them. This creates those information barriers that isolates things like HR, legal, and finance from the external facing teams like our solutions team or our support team or our sales team. Those information barriers also help Copilot to understand where it should look and where it should not look by redirecting and essentially giving guardrails around what Copilot can see. We give a user the best possible ability to not only get answers that they're looking for, but to ensure that the organization is covered in perpetuity while you're leveraging Copilot licensing. Taking the data from insights and building these policies is the start for where an organization should be looking when they're thinking about using Copilot. These are some of the more powerful rules that will help any organization. There is a full list of them, and I do encourage you to actually review that full list. But if you need a starting point, these are the easiest ones to adopt as they directly translate to every organization's needs when it comes to leveraging Copilot. The last big thing here I want to talk about is backend insights. So we've talked about the overview and the data, and we've talked about how we can build policies that specifically will enforce this moving forward. But in order for you to get to that point, you need to make sure that the users who have a Copilot license are going to have the right level of access. And this means not just looking at an overview, not just building policies on the tenant, but being able to zoom in on a user who has a Copilot license and really be able to understand what it is that they're going to be able to see. The search center over here gives us the ability to do that. With quick search, I can look for a specific individual. So I'm going to assign Ray a Copilot license in M365. But before I do that, I need to make sure Ray has access to the right workspaces. I'm not yet ready to enforce my policies. So I just want to do a quick snapshot and understand where Ray is today in terms of his level of access. Now, as I do that, right, I may want to do this for a bulk of users, right? So Ray, Rita, maybe Jay, all are going to get a Copilot license. So I don't just want to assess Ray, I might want to assess all three. We can build a batch search to do that as well. As you're looking for that data, the expectation is that you are going to see, right, one or more reports, and those reports should ultimately show you either what object, right? So if we're looking at this from the lens of the HR site, that might be an object versus the user. When I go through and review this, I can review that report, and this gives me a different way to understand the data. So I am now looking at this through the lens of the everyone group, specifically the everyone except external users group. So all of my internal users. I can see all the workspaces it has access to, whether they're direct, what type of data that it has access to. And then I can start to really look at from a slightly higher lens. When's the last time we've actually reviewed this? If I want to be able to drill into it, I can do that. Now I'm looking at this through the lens of the everyone except external users. This could be switched to Ray or Rita or any number of users. Everywhere that this is being leveraged, right? Everywhere that this group or this user has access, I'd be able to actually view the various data. This is not going to give me the ability to make changes directly here, right? I still need to be someone who's an admin if I want to access this actual link. But at a high level, it gives me a snapshot as an audit and compliance officer without being an admin of M365. Being able to view the permissions means I have a way to actually manage permissions directly from here. That can include reviewing the various users who are members or even editing the permissions. So if I want to adjust the permissions of the group, I can. When we're talking about Copilot, all of the policies that you've built are meant to future-proof the tenant as well as automate and bulk edit, make changes. But for the small pilot users, right? When we're talking about one or two or three, or we have very high profile power users that we need to investigate succinctly, using Insight's search mechanism gives us the ability to see that from the lens of the user. This ultimately culminates in an experience where I can actually audit against and see potentially any and all teams and their activities. By understanding the activities in the site, this gives me the means to understand whether this site is A, active, B, who might be active in it, and C, what they're doing. If any of these things raises a red flag, this might be an indicator that we need to lock down the actual access of this site. In this case, I can see my Q2 outings, there's no activity here. So this isn't a site I need to worry about specifically, right? I can move on and say that the everyone group having access to this is okay. There's nothing in here from an activity standpoint that warrants me having to target this specifically from permissions management. So we get to view the activities, which helps to drive that conversation and tell us where we need to go next. So just to kind of put it all back together, right? With a Copilot adoption framework in place, you're looking to understand who has access to what type of data and what they've been doing with it. Your goal should be to remediate the things that you can manually, but your end goal, right? That's your short term. Your long term should be to build a governance framework by leveraging intelligent remediation that tells us what rules do we see as being valuable based on my customer's environment. The insights reports here tell us which potential issues on this left-hand side we might want to investigate. The right-hand side tells us what rules we create to potentially get these numbers either to be zero, or at the bare minimum, they might still show up, but we know that those workspaces are now going to be locked down in such a way that even though there's external users, there's no sensitive data that the external users have access to. This one-to-one correlation gives you a direct ability to translate any sort of assessment for Copilot into a full-blown roadmap that ends with a governance framework that's wrapped around the customer's Copilot licensing. The partner portal gives you the tools to do this. At the end of the day, the AvePoint Partner Program is designed to give you all of the information that we've talked about, training as well as documentation, so that you can repeat this, but then you also have information that you can build upon. Things like that sample SOW are a great way to start if you've never had a service engagement around building a managed offering for something like Copilot adoption and readiness. But it also is a way for you to understand, how does AvePoint do it today? So if you're not familiar with how to implement, if you're not necessarily confident in how to adopt and enable something like this, the partner program gives you those tools in an ongoing basis so that you're going to be able to do this at your own pace. But more importantly, it gives you a starting point so you're not building from scratch. Hopefully, this has been helpful for everyone on the call.
Well, thank you very much, Jay. Good food for thought, definitely. Thank you for sharing that with us today. I'm just going to go back here and share one slide again. And it's the one about booking a call with us. Like I mentioned before, we're here, for you, our partners, and that don't hesitate, use this link, whether you use the QR code or if you click right now, you can click on book a call. Like I mentioned before, we're here to talk about 365, specifically, somewhat about security, where we can look at the different security aspects of the licenses, whether some of these security features inherent in some of these licenses can be used as a replacement or as a complement to existing solutions. We also have Teams telephony. whether you're thinking of migrating from a conventional, on-site on system where you would want to port these numbers into Microsoft for a Teams telephony system. Then we can talk about domestic calling, long distance calling, toll-free numbers, as well as, how can I possibly integrate that with other VoIP providers. Then we're here for that as well. And we also have one on Microsoft Azure where we can look at moving on-prem systems to the cloud. How do we move, let's say, some user desktops, some critical applications, accounting system or file servers, databases, domain controllers, and others. And then specifically what we talked about here today, which is policy and insights and relative to a Copilot, integration adoption by a client. So don't hesitate. Give us a call. Book a call with us, and we can definitely, look at all these aspects. And once again, thank you, Jay. Very, very much appreciated. Thank you for spending time with us. Does anyone have any questions for Jay at the moment? I don't see any questions in the chat. And as usual, we would ask if you would be so kind as to give us your evaluation of this webinar, because we're always trying to improve. They did the presentations themselves, improve the content. So therefore, your feedback is very important to us. So we would really, really appreciate your feedback and your comments on this webinar. Any last words from you, Jay?
Nothing other than thank you everyone for your time. Really appreciate being on the webinar
And
and giving a chance to kind of talk through this with everyone. Looking forward to furthering the conversations.
right, well, I'd like to thank you as well, Jay, for being with us today and to talk about this. And as well, thank you once again to our partners for taking the time and joining us today. And I don't see any questions in the chat at the moment. So thank you very much once again, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you.